Hello and welcome to Ideas Matter, the podcast from the Berggruen Institute. My name is Tui Schaub and today we speak with Alta Charo, Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a 2019 to 2020 Berggruen Fellow at CASBIS at Stanford University. Alta is a leading expert on the ethical and legal ramifications of biotech. Throughout her career, she's authored nearly 100 articles, book chapters, government reports, and white papers on topics including environmental law, medical genetics law, stem cell research, research ethics, and many more. She's currently a member of the World Health Organization's Expert Advisory Committee on Global Governance of Genome Editing. So today we are very fortunate to have her talk to us about the ethical questions and future implications that rise from both heritable and non-heritable human genome editing. And she gives us an overview on where we are today with global governance of human genome editing. Please enjoy.
So the first thing I'd like to do is simply give people a more vivid sense of what we're talking about with genome editing, the most modern version of which is called CRISPR. The concept is that in a very, very precise way, you can target an area of a gene that is problematic and is causing some kind of deleterious condition. And you can use the CRISPR-Cas9 system to very precisely identify that area and then do one of two things. You can either just delete the problematic area, and then the genes will then close up around that empty spot, or you can actually synthesize a healthy version of that gene and actually insert it as a substitute for the one that had been there. It's far more precise than the old genetic engineering systems that were almost like pellet guns that just shot genetic material into the cell and had a tendency to wind up in all kinds of unpredictable areas. Instead, this time you can actually be very, very precise. Not 100% yet, though, and that's one of the reasons why this technology is still very much in its early stages. There are two really distinct kinds of applications. One that's pretty well understood in terms of our regulations, and the other one that's really a challenge. Somatic editing is editing of the cells in a person's body except for the eggs or sperm. So you could, for example, edit the cells that are responsible for sickle cell disease. And then you would take out cells, you would edit them, you put them back in a way that would have them then replicate and repopulate the body with now properly functioning red blood cells. There are trials already going on for sickle cell disease, as well as for several different kinds of cancers and several different kinds of eye diseases. And this list will expand. There's a couple of dozen clinical trials already going on using this technology for so-called somatic editing. And from a regulatory standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. We've been regulating gene therapy experiments for decades now. It has had a slow and rocky path because of unpredicted side effects, one of which quite famously in the 1990s killed the human subject of that experiment. But it has at least a robust regulatory process for preclinical research, then getting approval from an independent arbiter, in our case, the Food and Drug Administration, clinical trials that start with small numbers and then move gradually to larger numbers of people, and then a process for approval, again, by an independent arbiter. Finally, a process for post-market surveillance where you look to see what happens over the long run. And indeed, for gene therapy, there's already a rule that says you must follow it out for 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the experiment. By contrast, germline, where the gametes, the eggs or sperm, are considered to be germ cells, germline gene editing does not have that kind of regulatory background. Here, what you would do is you would either make eggs or sperm from a person by taking, let's say, a piece of skin, using the cells from the skin to actually alter them through the same technology we use for stem cells, alter them to become eggs or sperm, and then edit them, and then create an embryo. That would allow you to have an embryo in which every single cell absolutely has this change, but you started with something very chancy, which is making sperm or making eggs out of a skin cell, which introduces lots of new possibilities for, frankly, catastrophe. The alternative is you take an embryo that was made through in vitro fertilization, which is now a very well understood technology, and you then introduce these edits into the embryo. This is much safer in terms of having at least a kind of normally conceived embryo, but on the other hand, there's the risk that some of the edits will get into some cells, but not all cells of the embryo. And if that happens, as the embryo grows into a fetus and then a baby, some cells in the body will have been edited and not others, and you get a mosaic, which may have some unpredictable effects. Now, many of us, by the way, are natural mosaics for one reason or another, and it's not always dangerous, but it certainly adds uncertainty. The other thing about germline editing that has really posed a regulatory problem is that by changing things at that level, you are now going to change the new sperm and eggs that are being created in the resulting fetus. So that when that child is born, whose genome was edited either at the gamete stage or at the embryo stage, that child now is going to produce his or her own gametes that will also have those edits, which means that the change you make today is going to flow through all the subsequent generations. So the benefits are magnified if what you've done is you've eliminated some deadly disease, but the risks are also magnified in case this also has some unexpected effect, like making somebody more vulnerable to cancer, which could happen. So for that reason, from a regulatory standpoint, this is extremely challenging. Not only do you have to do everything we do with gene therapy about looking at the science and understanding when the risk and benefit to the immediate human subjects is in a reasonable balance, but you have to be asking, do we have to now follow the people who were conceived this way throughout their entire lifetimes and their children's lifetimes and their children's children's lifetimes? How do we do post-market surveillance? How do we know what the long-term effects are when you've got multi-generational consequences from your experiment? This is a fundamental regulatory challenge. And yet there are some applications that are so tempting that we might want to use this technology to get rid of diseases that kill kids in their infancy. So for the moment, there's been a general consensus that somatic therapy is still in its early stages, but is adequately governed for most of its application areas. Not all, and I'll mention in a moment what some of those are. Whereas for germline, there's still a question about whether or not we can even imagine a regulatory system capable of handling it. For some people, even if you could regulate it properly and make it safe, it still would be unacceptable for reasons that go more to their value systems about human nature and about human control over human reproduction. But for those that are focused more on risks and unintended effects, the question is, can we come up with a governance system that could possibly get us there? In November of 2018, the National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences from the US, with partners from the United Kingdom's Royal Society and the Hong Kong Academy of Sciences, put on the second International Summit on Genome Editing. It was in the hours before the summit began that the news broke that this particular scientist from China, Hu Zhonghui, had actually edited human embryos and then implanted them and brought those embryos to term so that now 2 twin girls had been born whose bodies reflected those early gene edits. This was the first time that this had been done, and it set off a firestorm that pretty much took over the entire summit. And it took over the summit because there at that point had been not a single body in the world that thought that we were even close to being technically ready for this kind of experiment on people who were going to be born with edits in them. Second, because this purported reason for doing it was so inadequate. It had to do with HIV prevention in a context where the children were really not at much risk of HIV infection at all. But it did get everybody thinking hard about what would be a way to deal with this, not only at a national level like the FDA for the US, but at a global level. And pretty clearly, you have to recognize that there is no such thing as global law. We don't have a global police. We don't have a global mechanism for uniform policy or enforcement. And treaties and other formal international documents like conventions are possible, but they're extremely difficult to negotiate. They take a very long time. They tend to be very high level and not very specific. So they're better at saying things are permitted or forbidden, but not very good at saying how they should be regulated. But we do have one example in this area of several countries that got together specifically on heritable germline editing. And that is the Oviedo Convention from the Council of Europe. You need something like that if you're going to try to get any uniformity, because this is from the Genetic Literacy Project, which has some wonderful resources. You could go from country to country and find an infinite number of variations on how this would be regulated or how it's not regulated at all. The Oviedo Convention took a very hard line on heritable forms of editing. It said, an intervention seeking to modify the human genome is only permitted when it's for preventive purposes or therapeutic purposes, and only if the idea is to make sure it only affects the person who's been treated, but doesn't change the next generation, right? I want to just mention for a moment the reason why they have the language there about preventive or therapeutic. That's because of the concern that in some cases, you might try to use these technologies not for disease, but for so-called enhancement. The form of genome editing that's now being investigated for muscular dystrophy in order to restore muscle capacity for boys who have very little because of that disease is a technology that might be changed a little bit, but then used by somebody who's got ordinary muscle strength to try to become even stronger. That would be something that many people would call enhancement, because you're going beyond what is ordinary in an effort to become extraordinary. It's a subtle area of discussion because, of course, people come with great variation. And is there something inherently wrong with me wanting to be as good as anybody else, even though I wasn't born that way? Is that an impermissible form of enhancement? I had a cataract taken out of one of my eyes, and when they put in the artificial lens, they put one in that gave me 20/20 distance vision in that eye, which I never had. So that was an enhancement. Should they have put back the crummy distance vision I used to have after taking out the cataract? That would be the only way to avoid enhancing me. So this itself becomes an interesting conversation we might want to pick up on, because it becomes a much more difficult thing to do. And it's quite timely as we talk about developing a vaccine to enhance people's immunity to the COVID-19 virus, because that's also an enhancement of our immune systems. But the Oviedo Convention was really focused more than anything else, not on enhancement, but on anything having to do with multi-generational changes, whether they were therapeutic or enhancing. Either one would be considered impermissible. And there are about 24 countries in Europe that have signed on to this, so that we have in Europe a situation in which, for most countries, you have a sophisticated system for regulating somatic therapies using gene editing, systems that are capable of dealing with enhancement issues, because they would look at this and say, is the benefit good enough to justify the residual risks of even this form of somatic gene editing? You know, the more that you're not curing a disease, the less likely it is you can argue the benefit outweighs the remaining risks. So they're pretty okay on the regulatory side in Europe for somatic. And germline, pretty much illegal throughout most of Europe because they signed on to the Oviedo Convention. There's now an open question, now that the UK has divorced itself from the EU, because although the Council of Europe and the EU are not the same thing, it looks like this is a moment where the UK is going to go its own way on a lot of issues. And they have been more open than any European country to advances in reproductive technologies. In the United States, we have the FDA, which has a very highly regulated system for gene therapy that is somatic. On germline, technically, it is not illegal in the United States. You'd simply have to get permission from the FDA to even try it as a clinical experiment. But a few years ago, Congress wrote a provision into the budget that basically says FDA can't spend any time or money reviewing a request to start such a study. That makes it functionally illegal in the US. You can ask for permission, but nobody there is allowed to review your application. It's a really classic kind of Washington trick built into the budget. It has to get enacted every time the budget gets enacted, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. Finally, in China, which is where this whole story kind of began, we have a very complicated situation. They've had year after year individual laws that touch on one thing or another concerning assisted reproduction and cloning, but none of them spoke directly to the kind of thing that Hu Zhonghui had done. And as a result, the legality of what he did in China is actually debatable. Although the Chinese scientific community quickly stepped up to condemn him, the fact of the matter is, it was not very clear how many people were condemning him before it happened. And so this is one of the reasons why he was able to do what he did and make the presentation that he made in Hong Kong. When he returned, however, he returned to a country that was not happy about the firestorm he had created with this announcement. He was put under house arrest for quite a long period of time and ultimately was convicted on a criminal charge, but it was not a criminal charge of having violated their assisted reproduction laws or their laws about cloning or genome editing or anything like that. He was convicted of practicing medicine without a license. It reminded me in the United States of the Chicago mob in the early part of the 20th century, where you get a conviction for tax evasion because you couldn't catch them on anything else that they were doing. But one thing that did flow out of that experience in Hong Kong was two independent efforts on the global stage to try and find our way through this question of a global approach to governing this technology. The first is the International Commission on the Clinical Use of Human Germline Genome Editing. This is a joint project organized by various national academies around the world of medicine and science, and its focus is entirely on the heritable germline editing. So it's very narrowly focused, and the idea was this. Some countries are going to say this is fundamentally a violation of human rights. We don't want it even if it's safe. Others are going to say, well, for our purposes, we think it's acceptable if it were safe enough and important enough, but we haven't seen any proof that it's safe enough and important enough yet. So the International Commission's job is to figure out what a country would need to have by way of scientific research on safety and effectiveness in laboratory experiments and animal experiments before they could ever responsibly approve an experiment to edit gametes or edit embryos that were going to be used to gestate and result in live-born children. Again, not every country is going to want to do this, even if they can have this kind of scientific information. But if a country is going to do it, and we figured some would, then at least make sure that they know what they need to know in order to regulate it rigorously. The International Commission is already at work. The second is this WHO committee, which was set up to look more broadly at both somatic and germline applications and to look more at the kind of governance options that exist, not just formal regulatory options like an FDA, but anything else that might be brought to bear on this. And that committee is also has been stood up, and I think Tui mentioned that that's the one that I'm a member of. Here are some of the issues the International Commission is going to focus on, right? What are the genetic diseases that really are serious and not yet amenable to some alternate kind of intervention after birth? You know, a lot of diseases can be managed after birth. Why would you do something tricky and new? Second, how do you design experiments so that you would know whether something was safe? How do you measure any unexpected consequences? How do you develop a long-term follow-up, even if it's just in one person's lifetime? How do you assess the potential problems of the mosaicism? And then finally, given how new it is, how in the world can you expect people to give informed consent, especially when, you know, sometimes you really may want to do this on a child, not on an adult, because you're trying to get a disease before it really takes its toll on that child. So they are working on that, and the expectation is that they will issue a report the first week of September or sometime thereabouts. And that will set us up for the World Health Organization Committee, which is looking at several different topics that go beyond the International Commission. The first was this recognition that we simply need to know what's going on out there in the world. And so one of the first things that our committee did was launch a global clinical trials registry. Anybody who does a clinical trial with gene editing, and at this point it's all somatic editing, will have to register that clinical trial so that everybody knows what's going on and knows where to be looking for new evidence about how to do it safely, how to follow up. Ultimately, if any country approves clinical trials for Germline, that will go on the registry as well. The second is to try and give governments around the world a framework for what they have to do if they're going to adopt regulations for this area, somatic or germline. They have to first decide whether or not it's going to be permissible at all. That's particularly relevant for germline. Then they got to decide, what are you going to do about your cross-border issues? What if one of your scientists goes to a different country where it's allowed and then comes home where it's forbidden? What if one of your citizens goes to another country where it's allowed and comes back where it was forbidden? How are you going to manage those things? And are you going to penalize people? This is a very real issue. I mean, today in France, it's illegal to use a paid surrogate mother. Some French citizens have gone to other countries, hired surrogates, had children, come back to France, and the French will not grant French national recognition to the child as a child of that family because it violates what would have been the law in France if they tried it there. And these children are now being rendered stateless in some cases. So, this kind of cross-border coordination is a very important part of any regulatory framework. Do what you want to do in your own borders. Make sure we understand how it interacts. Second, when it comes to somatic therapy, what do you want to do about enhancement? Do you want to permit it? Do you want to forbid it? If you're going to forbid it, how do you define it? Is my cataract operation enhancement or not? Needs to be clear to everybody. If you're going to permit it, how do you want your regulatory people to view these benefits? Because benefits are often very subjective. My ability to be stronger or taller or be less prone to obesity are all very value-laden kinds of things that I might care about much more than you, or vice versa. So whose view of the benefit is going to go into that risk-benefit equation? Even if the risks are empirical and measurable, the benefits may not be. You also have to anticipate two things, some things that are going to be coming up in the future. One is so-called epigenetic editing, and I'll mention it again at the end. This is where you don't edit the gene itself, you edit those things that actually affect how the gene functions. And it can be temporary. I'll talk about it later, but it means that you're going to have a different way of thinking about risks and benefits if something is reversible. And then finally, another thing that must go into your thinking for a framework is what we call genome editing tourism. In the area of stem cell therapy, we have now had 20 years of experience with flim-flam operators advertising miracle cures for everything from baldness to Parkinson's disease using stem cell therapy. And the reason that they're able to do this, and the reason that they're able to attract people to travel halfway across the globe and spend tens of thousands of dollars to go to their clinics, is because the phrase stem cell had almost a magic quality to it, precisely because one form of stem cells, embryonic stem cells, had been so widely debated because of the controversial nature of that research. And the need to defend the research and talk about its potential led people to think this is the miracle cure. It also made it easy for people to confuse that with a much older technology using adult stem cells that had nothing to do with any of the embryonic stem cell debates. But in internet land and advertising land, these things got conflated. And so you had people traveling to places to get therapies that were absolutely not ready and probably would never be ready. In some cases, who knows what they were being injected with. Genome editing has the same possibility ahead of it, of creating what we call risk havens, countries that don't regulate at all and allow these flim-flam operators to become magnets for people coming from more highly regulated areas. So you need to figure out, how are you going to govern so that a country that wants to be super strict can be super strict. A country that wants to be a little bit more liberal on, let's say, enhancement or germline can do that if they have a responsible regulation, but not turn into a risk haven where they become a kind of a gutter for gutter science. This is part of the work of the WHO committee, is trying to help governments figure out how to write rules that will address these kinds of things. So we are looking at a way to have countries to coordinate rather than try to have the same rules everywhere. Let's try to agree on some very basic principles. Let's agree on a system of mutual recognition of one another's varying systems, while we also allow countries to have their own policies. And then let's anticipate this kind of cross-border behavior. The kinds of principles we're talking about could vary, but here's an example from the National Academy's report that I co-chaired, with Richard Hines from MIT. And these may sound like mom and apple pie, but the idea was you have principles that you write down, and then every time you're about to adopt a rule, you ask, is it consistent with these? Is it consistent with the idea of promoting the well-being, not just of health, but all forms of well-being? Does it respect people's autonomy so that somebody might want to use it and another person might not want to? One person who's deaf may want to use the technology to restore hearing in the future. Another person who's deaf may want to say, I'm fine the way I am. So you have to have respect for people having different views about what they do and do not want to use the technology for. Is it offered to people in a way that's fair, without discrimination, based upon some irrelevant characteristic? Is it offered in a responsible way? That's where due care comes in. Have you had science of high integrity with honest reporting of results and honest exploration of both benefits and risks? And then have you explained those to people and made sure that your regulatory system avoids letting people walk into something that's far more dangerous than anybody should encounter? And finally, some transparency to make sure that your policies for implementing these things are things that include a role for the public and for the political organs of your country, so that there is a collective decision about how to regulate this area, how to govern the area. When you're doing this and when you're creating this framework, the most obvious place to start is the FDA type regulator. And absolutely, that is at the core of this. Formal government regulation is at the core, but there are other tools for governance, and they can all work to reinforce one another so that you have a kind of ecosystem approach. One is funding conditions. I will give you funding provided that you take the following protective measures. You only, let's say, recruit to your clinical trial, let's say adults, because they can give consent the way children can't, or you only will allow somebody to do it in somatic for the moment with a disease burden of X. You won't let them do it for the moment in enhancement. This can be an indirect form of regulation, whether the funding is public or private. You can certainly enhance the kind of ethics reviews that are already required for human subjects research. We have local institutional review boards. And for clinical care, we have hospital ethics committees. But there's been a lot of discussion about having specialized review committees that are deeply expert in the risks and benefits and the ongoing scientific developments, specifically in the areas of genome editing and genetic engineering, who offer an extra layer of review. We used to have that, by the way, for many years when the National Institutes of Health had something called the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, the RAC, which would do this kind of extra layer of review. Its role has changed over the years, but now there's this thought that maybe some version of that should be brought back either at the national level or even at the global level to offer some assistance. Then you could talk to journal editors about how they can also be part of this regulatory system. We now have journals that say, we are not going to publish your research unless you provide documentary evidence you complied with all the regulations. It could be institutional biosafety if it's recombinant DNA. It could be IACUCs if it's animal care issues. And it could be the IRBs if it's human subjects. And the journals won't publish unless you've provided that. And some of them will go the next step and even take an independent look at the research and say, was it ethical to do that research at all? So they can play an important part in regulating what gets out into the legitimate scientific literature. Of course, that's only the legitimate scientific literature, so that doesn't do anything for the rogue that's going to publish their scientific discoveries in the newspaper as opposed to the journal Science. We could talk about having the insurers play a role. I'm not talking only about healthcare insurers who do or do not pay for a particular procedure that they view as experimental. I'm talking about the liability insurers who are providing liability insurance for the laboratories and the university campuses and the companies that are doing this work. Because if they're going to do something that is got tremendous risks and they haven't gone through a proper regulatory process, then if anything goes wrong, they really could have created tremendous amounts of damage, financially speaking, and the insurers should be aware that they may have a liability exposure there if they don't write out an exemption in their policies. And you know that if the insurers won't cover it in their policies, a lot of places won't do this at all. So how many of those flim-flam clinics would go out of business if their liability insurers said, we won't cover you for the injuries you inflict on people with some of your flim-flam stem cell interventions? Some of those things really have been horrible. There's a woman in Southern California who actually had bone growing out of her eyes because of mesenchymal stem cells that were injected as part of a cosmetic procedure to get rid of the crow's feet around her eyes, because the clinic didn't know what it was doing and it wasn't supposed to be doing it at all, right? Finally, professional society norms. The scientific community is one that operates a little bit like Hollywood. You measure your value not just in terms of money, but in terms of status. The university that wants to have you, the keynote speech that you're invited to make. And so if a professional society says, we will only allow you to be a member in good standing if you follow the guidelines that we are setting down for our own selves, we're going to self-regulate and say this is responsible and this is not, there are many, many scientists that will comply. And we did this successfully with stem cell guidelines in the US and then across the globe with the International Society for Stem Cell Research. So one possibility is to take advantage of that. Again, none of this will get rid of every single rogue, but it would have helped even in China, where He Jiankui, who had to collaborate with hospitals and IVF doctors and laboratory personnel in order to do what he did, would have run into obstacles if all of those other professionals felt that there was something wrong about what they were doing, violated their own professional society norms, the institution didn't feel that it had appropriate liability insurance, there were ethics boards that needed to be consulted that weren't. It might not have stopped him, but it might have slowed him. Let me conclude by saying what's next. One thing that's really intriguing is in utero editing. That would be editing a fetus while it's still in the womb. There are some conditions like cystic fibrosis, which affect multiple systems, not just in CF, the lungs, but also the digestive tract. As a result, if you try to treat it with genetic engineering after birth, you may already be in a situation where there's damage to multiple parts of the body. So you'd like to be able to do something earlier. What if you could change the genetic problem, correct the genetic problem while still in the fetal stage? You would be able to get at this far earlier before the systems have been damaged. And if you do it at, let's say, the second trimester, you're doing it after the gametes have formed, so it's not going to affect the eggs or sperm that the fetus is developing. But it does have tremendous implications for the politics around pregnancy and abortion. To be able to diagnose a condition and then figure out what you might want to do in terms of an intervention, and then do the intervention and do it early enough that if it goes wrong, you still have the option of terminating the pregnancy, puts it all pretty late in the second trimester. And that's where, of course, there's some particular level of controversy around abortion rights. So that's not an unproblematic innovation, but I do think people should expect it's going to be coming. And then epigenetic editing. If you think of the genes as the keys on the piano, and they come in different combinations of white keys and black keys. It's the pedals that change the kind of sound you get from the chord that you're playing, and that's the epigenetic editing. Has to do with the way things are wrapped around the genes. And if you could change that, you could change whether or not a gene is expressing itself strongly or not. It's potentially reversible. So for example, you might be able to temporarily affect the way the body perceives pain. For people who've got cancer, this would be a blessing, because there are some forms of cancer that are extremely painful, and the only treatments we really have is to just give people massive doses of opioids, which leave them feeling stupid and really take away from the pleasure of life. But do you also want to use it then for war fighters, who then are going to be able to engage in activities that ordinarily they couldn't? And are you comfortable with that? This kind of dual use issue is typical of many technologies. So far, I've talked only about human applications, but that is only the beginning. We haven't even begun to talk about applications for editing of animals. So edited animals so that it's, let's say its feces has less phosphorus, and now less phosphorus runoff from your big agricultural settings means less algae growing in our lakes, and fewer fish dying from oxygen deprivation in these algae-choked lakes. Plants that need to become drought resistant as the climate changes, edited so that they can, in fact, store water more efficiently, so that they can grow in the same areas that they were growing. Or a picture of the park there is because one of my favorite things that I came across was the idea that you would genetically edit grass so that it glowed in the dark. And you wouldn't need to expend all that energy on lights. Plus, you'd be able to see the sky a whole lot better if the pathways were simply gently glowing grass paths, all through genetic engineering. So really, I think whether it's human applications or it's ag or it's just making your flowers change color during the day for the fun of it, genetic engineering is only at its beginning, and gene editing is its newest and most precise tool. Thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alta. I am so glad that you went from rogue black markets and bones growing out of eyes to the more pleasant image of plants having low water requirements and glowing grass. So many of the stories that you've discussed here, I don't know where to start. It was also really excellent in terms of putting it in a way that we can all, I think, relate. We know stories, we understand the philosophical and the moral arguments. So that's very interesting, and I can't thank you enough for making it very clear and accessible. A few things came to mind. I had prepared some questions, but of course your talk made me think of others. But I'm going to ask a question, and then I'd like to open up to everybody. There were a couple instances in the chat. I don't know, Alta, if you can see that. If anybody else wants to raise their hand or pop their name into the chat, I will call on you. But I want to ask my question first.
Okay.
You've mentioned before that we have an outdated notion of what it is to say that something is a species. And that we are taught in school that our genetic code delivers vertically and outward like a tree with branches, when actuality we are a mishmash of different species kinds of cells, and that there's a horizontal notion of genes that blurs the species line, which I thought was a really beautiful way of articulating this tension of human and nature, and that this is a very interesting observation for me, in particular in the program that I'm involved with and I work with, and it's the Transformations of the Human program, where we challenge the firm, discrete ontologies that separate nature and the human.
Right.
And Darwin famously remarked that the term species is actually misleading, for in reality there is only steady change. So one could consider genome, perhaps, at genome editing in line with this theory of change in the mechanisms of how we build or enhance organisms. So this is all to say, would it be going too far to say that regulation is actually much more of an interference philosophically speaking, with nature than gene editing?
I think that regulation that is excessively focused on prohibiting things is built on a simplistic and somewhat false understanding of nature, because it sees nature as static. And
Right.
it sees some of these interventions as deviating from what is supposed to be. It has a notion of fate built into it. And your point about Darwin is quite correct, that in fact, nature is a condition of constant change. Also very poorly understood by most of the public. It's not necessarily constant change always towards something better.
Right.
It's not a teleological phenomenon in which we're always advancing toward an ideal. It has a lot of random twists and turns. So yes, the instinct to prohibit because something is an excessive interference with a nature is, I think, inconsistent with that notion of change. But I think it also comes out of something else, and that is the ways in which people imagine the role of the human vis-a-vis the deity that is at the core of their own particular religious traditions. Some religious traditions are built on the idea of a God that is an active intervener in daily life. God decides something happens, and you can pray to God, and God may answer your prayers by giving you what you ask for. That's a very intercessory prayers. That's a very active version of God. And there's this notion that somehow there's a level of control that we're not supposed to exercise because it's really stepping on God's domain. Playing God is the phrase you'll hear. For other religions, interestingly though, the notion of a deity is far more remote. Sets things in motion at the beginning of time and then steps back, so that now Mendelian genetics tells us that in certain areas, your chance of a kid's going to be 1 in 4 or 1 in 2 having this condition. And it's just statistics and roll of the dice. It's not God choosing. And so if you as an individual intervene to select this embryo and not that embryo, or to fix this embryo and not fix that one, that's not playing God, that's playing human. Because God's the one who created a system of statistics and randomness. Humans are the ones who decided to change that, right? So there are these really fundamentally different kind of embedded instincts that people have that they don't even necessarily recognize in their own selves as coming out of a religious tradition, whether or not they go to church, synagogue, or mosque every week or not. I mean, it's more about the kind of, it was in the air that they breathed in their family home from the time they were a kid, the way people talked about things. The more that I think we can be self-aware of where our instincts are coming from, the better it is for debating these things sensibly, because then I can recognize, oh, I understand, it's because you and I don't share the same faith tradition. So now let's see, can we talk about this separate from those? Or do we have to build a world in which you can do it one way and I'll do it another? 2 different ways of handling this difference, but at least we now know what we're arguing about, right?
Right.
But that's a big trick.
Yeah. And, you know, we think about ourselves in the West as a very unique, discrete individual, as compared to, you know, in China, perhaps identity is relational. And perhaps that's why gene editing and kind of tinkering with the DNA is not quite as ferociously sort of suspect. It's not as suspect in China and the East.
You know, it's so interesting. If you ask, let's talk about germline heritable only, because that's the most controversial one, right, even though it's the least important one in terms of the numbers of people who will ever use it. The whole concept here is that there are people who want to have children that are genetically related to them, but don't have to suffer the risk of a genetic disease that otherwise would be passed on, or at least has a strong chance of being passed on, right? So these are people who have decided they don't want to adopt children or use at least one donor of egg or sperm in order to avoid this outcome, because they want to have this genetic relationship. Those are the people who are thinking of genetics as linear only. They're forgetting that they're also genetically related to their nieces and their nephews and their brothers and their sisters. So where is this drive to see your genetics in your child coming from? And remember I said earlier that, you know, benefits are very subjective. That's a super subjective benefit. How much credence should we give that when balancing it against the risk that the technology is going to result in a child who's got some unintended vulnerability. Let's say the tumor suppressor genes have been affected so that now the child is more prone to cancers, even though the child was born without this devastating, let's say, was born without Huntington's disease. You know, I don't know a regulatory agency in the world that can give you a technical answer to the value of having a child that is genetically related to both of the rearing parents. But I can tell you that the importance of that connection will vary not only from family to family, but from country to country. And so your regulators are going to look at the kind of culture of the country overall, and then they're going to also have to ask how much credence do we give the individual parents in their subjective valuation here. So yeah, you may have countries where they really find it completely unacceptable because it's just not that important to have kids that are genetically related to you, so we're not going to take any chances. And other countries where it's considered absolutely essential, and where tracing ancestry in a linear fashion is core to identity, and where almost any kind of risk will be worth it if it allows parents to do that. And in fact, I've already seen some examples of this kind of variation. You know, the Israelis are much more open to a lot of this because the experience in the Holocaust and the loss of so many Jews meant that they are incredibly pro-natalist. And because Jewish law says that religion transmits through the mother, they're particularly aware of the need to maintain the genetic lineage from mother to child. You don't see that in other countries. You see it in Israel, and interestingly, you see it in a lot of the Arab countries because there is also a very strong tradition about lineage being linear. You may not see the same thing in the South Pacific. Right? So
right. Yeah,
it's one of the reasons why governance has to be tolerant of global variation.
Absolutely, yes. So I see that the chat is building up some momentum over here. Berggruen Institute, maybe that was Dawn, I don't know which member that was, said, is there such a thing as reversible gene editing?
Yes, that would be the epigenetic editing, where you don't change the gene itself, but where you simply change how strongly or weakly the gene expresses. That is absolutely reversible. It could be reversible because you have made a change that dissipates on its own, or because it's one that can be reversed through a new intervention. To reverse actual gene editing itself would require re-editing of the gene. So in theory, absolutely, you could do it, but it's more problematic.
So Layla, do you want to unmute yourself and give us your question, please?
Sure. So I am wondering what sort of effect genetic engineering could have on our understanding on the value of disabled people. I think this has been something that obviously has been evolving a lot for quite some time. And depending on a lot of different social factors, depending on the country that you're in, you know, the place of disabled people in society can range from bad to worse. So I'm wondering, like, what sort of consequences genetic engineering could have on our understanding of disability rights. For example, like genetic discrimination in the workplace might become a new thing. Like, why would you feel the need to hire someone who is disabled when you can hire someone who's genetically modified? I guess that's a really weird way of putting it, but yeah.
So this is one of the reasons why in that slide about principles we had respect in there, because it's respect for the diversity of people and their choices. Diversity of people in terms of their capacities, their body forms, etc., and then respect for the choice about whether or not they want to alter that. Because we face this question over and over again. Every time we come up with a treatment or a cure for a condition, the question is going to be, what about the people who either choose not to use it or who are not able to take advantage of it for one reason or another? Is it going to make their lives worse because they're either going to be even a smaller minority than they were before, so there'll be less societal motivation to accommodate by changing our physical environment, for example? Are they going to be worse off because they're going to be perceived as somehow being obstructionist by refusing to take advantage of this technology? They are Luddites that are refusing to be modern, fixed people. So this has absolutely been an issue. It's been an issue when amniocentesis came on board, an issue for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, an issue for cochlear implants, which is not about reproduction, but it's postnatal kinds of interventions. I think there's several responses. One is I don't know that you can expect that there's going to be a single response on the part of everybody who shares a particular characteristic. So the first question we have to ask is who really ought to be the decider? Is it the individual or is it society? And that's a really interesting question of political philosophy. If it's going to be the individuals and some people are going to take advantage and others people are not, then how do we build into the system the guardrails that will make sure that we continue to accommodate for people who choose not or cannot use these technologies? The one thing that helps us there, frankly, is that we all become disabled at some point in our lives. You know, we all face these things as we get older, as we have skiing accidents. We are constantly faced with some kind of challenge or another. And so I don't see society becoming completely intolerant of people with disabilities anytime soon. But I do think that as these technologies are moving through regulation, if they're permitted, I think we do need to have a parallel movement to instantiate and expand upon the kind of protections that we now have for people who have disabilities, making sure that the world is available to them and that they're not cut out of it. To prohibit the technology completely, I think, though, is the kind of solution that is a cure worse than the disease.
Sorry, I just have a quick follow-up question to that. I'm especially curious about the sort of trade-off between gene editing and then the value of disease, especially in cases where we don't fully understand disease or disability. So like, for example, like polycystic diseases, there are some very clear downsides, like women with polycystic diseases can't have children or oftentimes have, you know, lessened ability to have children. They're more likely to have fatty liver. There's a lot of downsides to it, but more and more scientists are finding that there's evolutionary beneficial upsides. For example, women who have polycystic syndrome, who are really fit, are able to put on muscle way faster than women who do not have it. Or in a lot of the cases that have been kind of the cases that are coming out more and more, polycystic women are like hormone proportions that I don't fully understand, but certain hormone proportions that I've understood to be more beneficial than like the average woman without a polycystic disease. So I guess my question is, couldn't we also hurt ourselves in terms of our scientific understanding of disease and disability by prioritizing gene editing?
Well, I think that's going to be true of any kind of cure. I mean, women with polycystic disease will often be prescribed metformin. And if that is now going to be something that changes their hormone balance between estrogen and testosterone, then you're getting the same problem of kind of hiding what might be otherwise an interesting scientific kind of observation about the way in which that particular condition affects their systems. But with gene editing in particular, I think, first of all, we're never going to wipe it out of the population because we're never going to have germline editing being done on a scale necessary to affect the actual frequency on a global level, at least not in any foreseeable future. Because among many other things, germline editing would only be used for truly devastating conditions if it's ever used at all. You know, it requires IVF, it requires a tremendous investment of risky technology. You know, most things can be dealt with after birth. They don't need this kind of drastic intervention. And frankly, sex is more fun and it's less expensive than IVF. So I don't think it's going to get wiped out through heritable forms. When it comes to somatic treatments, I think then you're looking at gene editing like we'd look at any kind of drug treatment or medical device treatment. I think that there we do run into exactly the problem you talk about. If it becomes ubiquitous as a treatment, then we may very well lose the knowledge of something. And I don't know the right answer to that because we don't know when we're going to lose something. And I'm not sure we want to put, you know, hundreds of thousands of people through the turmoil of having a disease that's left uncorrected so that we take on the chance that we might learn something by leaving it uncorrected. It's why risk and benefit is a tricky balance, but never perfect. There'll still be, by the way, always some people that don't get treated. Unfortunately, we live in a world of health inequities of vastly different capacities. And so sad to say, there'll be some people who are always untreated that can serve to teach the rest of us something that we failed to learn because we were busy taking care of ourselves.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to go to GKE. Who is GKE? Is that Gabriel Kahan? He's asking, what are the best tools, practices you found to help with the necessary self-awareness you speak of?
Wow. Endless committee meetings. You can never have enough good committee meetings, you know? But truly, it really is about having forums over and over in different settings of professionals, of lay people with professionals, of people from different religions, of people from different economic backgrounds, who are constantly talking to one another, because it takes a long time before you can kind of detect in the conversation the patterns that are forming in how people discuss these things. I find that it's very hard to be aware of one's own unconscious biases until you are talking to somebody who doesn't share them. It really takes looking in a mirror. You know, anybody who's ever traveled outside the US has probably had a bit of that experience where you realize that there are things we just assume about, you know, how you stand online waiting for tickets. You just you never thought that anybody did it differently until you go someplace where
London is very, very serious business when it comes to queuing. It's a whole, there's a real protocol involved.
Right. And please, I got to tell you, when I've been in Italy or Israel, they have another whole way of thinking about it. It involves a lot of people just rushing the window. So, so yeah, I mean, it takes that kind of mirror to begin to detect your own unconscious biases, and then being willing to admit to them. I don't think there's any trick to that one except to hope that people do it.
Mm.
Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I just wanted to, it is Gabriel who asked that question. But is there anything, are there any practices, any handbooks, any methodologies that you use to create these gatherings? Which ones do you use, and which ones are there any that come to mind that you reuse over and over to gather the input?
Yeah, so there are people who specialize in public engagement, theories of public engagement and of science communication. One of my colleagues here at Wisconsin, Dietram Scheufele, Scheufele, writes quite a lot about this and has helped me to understand at least the different kinds of engagement, where you're looking to engage with the public to find out what they think versus to teach people versus to give them a chance to form policy by voting. These are all very different kinds of engagements, but he's the specialist and I'm not. But if you look him up, that might be the first place to start your Googles, and it'll send you outward into the reports that have been written about these things.
Thank you.
Great.
Yes, thank you, Tui, and thank you, Alta Charo, for joining us. I'll try to abridge my question a little bit. Perhaps the most common critique of gene editing is that it will lead to a new class of genetically superior humans, which will exacerbate the current disparities and inequalities that we have within our societies. And I was wondering if, on the flip side of that, from your point of view, could gene editing lead to a more equal society? And are there ways that we can address inequalities and lack of access?
Okay, so let me take the first part, the fear that it's going to create the genetic caste system. I think that tends to come up in the context of heritable forms. And as I said, I think that the numbers are incredibly small. So I don't fear that very much. We already have a biological caste system, and it's not because of genetic editing. And it's not even because of other genetic technologies like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. It's because from the very first moment after conception, there are some people whose nutrition and physical environment and subsequent education are going to definitely lead to a healthier outcome. So we already have that. And I can't imagine that gene editing could ever play a role that comes even close to the scale of effect that those very common phenomena already have: nutrition, environment, and education. Could it be used, however, to even the playing field? A little bit, but it takes a new way of thinking about how to use the technology. So, example, I think I mentioned sickle cell in passing during the presentation. Right now, the way in which we're doing sickle cell trials in the United States has been to have somebody who is going to have blood taken away. The blood is then engineered outside the body, and then it is reintroduced into the body. It also requires bone marrow transplants, and it's incredibly expensive, and it requires sophisticated hospitals. That is simply not going to be feasible in many parts of West Africa, and yet that's where the disease is most prevalent. So from very early days, the Gates Foundation began investing in trying to figure out how to do this thing with sickle cell editing in a fashion that would be usable in areas that have fewer hospitals or less money to spend on a particular patient. And so they're looking at so-called in vivo. Instead of taking the blood out of the body, is there some way we could simply inject something into somebody that would then start a chain reaction that changes the cells in the body? That might be a far more feasible way of doing this. And in that sense, we can look to ways to, from the very beginning, try and imagine a delivery system for these technologies that is location appropriate, and not only build it for our own country, but build it for the globe. So yes, it can do that. But again, I don't think that that's going to be the answer to the scale of inequities that are caused by nutrition, environment, and education, which I think really are where we want to start.
The microbiome is terribly affected by those things that you mentioned. That's a caste system in itself, the food that's available, and et cetera, and quality of life.
Yeah, the role that nutrition plays is complex, and the microbiome, you're right, I haven't even mentioned it, but it also points to the fact that we are not separate from nature. We are actually a little collection of critters.
Yeah, we are. Little critters. They're helpful for the most part, these little critters.
Yeah.
I actually worry about all of the antibacterial gel that's being used during this COVID time for our microbiome friends. But
it's not only that, it's the gene, even in our genome, there are sequences that come from bacteria and viruses. I mean, that's exactly why CRISPR-Cas9 works. So we have really, right into our genomes, we have incorporated other little critters over time.
Yes, bonkers. Mashinka, let's finish with your question, and then I would love everybody to unmute and give a little round of applause. But Mashinka, please.
This has been so fantastically interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
An honor and a pleasure. My question was also a bit long, so I'm going to just abridge on the fly in the interest of not overtaxing anybody. So I was really interested in your discussion in the questions that you posed around the value-laden nature of calculations around benefit and risk. And this feeds a little bit into Layla's question. It feeds a little bit into Arya's question. So I'm thinking about announcements like Denis Rebrikov's announcement that he was going to work with 5 couples with hereditary deafness to edit out deafness from their sequences. And so I'm wondering, so in this case, it's Denis Rebrikov who's decided that this is something that is worth pursuing. So I'm curious about maybe stepping back from disability a bit and asking more broadly about the kind of general frameworks that are in place. And you touched on these a bit in your presentation, but I'd love to hear more about the frameworks that are in place for determining metadiscursively who gets to determine what and how determines who is permitted to determine the trajectory of gene editing.
Well, that's the $64 million question. It really is. Let me take an example that's less loaded, okay? And I'll take it from my time when I was at the Food and Drug Administration. There was a discussion about a drug that was already on the market that was aimed at kids with asthma. And it had come to the attention of the agency that there was a 1 in X, and it was a very small number, I forget what it was, a 1 in X chance that the drug might cause the kid to die. But it also was a drug that allowed kids to sleep through the night more effectively. And there was a huge debate going on about whether or not the drug should be pulled from the market or put, black box warnings on it because of the risk of death. And the conversation moved to, well, how do you value the benefit of being able to sleep through the night? Is it just the pleasure of sleeping through the night, or is it the fact that the kids are less sleepy in the morning and now they're doing better in school? And if they do better in school, maybe that means that they have a better outcome in life generally, but boy, that's a very indirect relationship. What about the fact that the parents can stay asleep at night because the kid's not waking up? I mean, it became very complicated. One thing that came out of it was the need to have public meetings in which patients, families, in this case it was the parents of the patients, had a chance to talk about their real experiences and how it affected their lives and the lives of their children. So it was a recognition that the regulators needed to have more interplay with the people who are most closely affected. But there was no way you could statistically sample everybody in a rigorous fashion and then come to some conclusion about what's the value of. There was, however, at least an effort to try to figure out, okay, here's the value medically speaking. How many kids are going to have a hospitalization? How many kids are going to need at least a drug nebulizer treatment? How many kids will simply have broken sleep? And then, what do we know about the sequelae of those different kinds of things for their health in general? And put some kind of these categories on it. And that was the best that could be done. And that was just something that's less subjective than deafness. Right? For things like deafness, I think, the deaf community is really special because the fact that they have a language that is their own unique language means that they have become a cultural community in a way that people with other kinds of disabilities don't. I mean, I actually have a genetic defect in my visual system. And so I've never had true depth perception. I can't catch a fly ball if my life depended on it. I've been clumsy all my life. And that has certainly affected my personality. And I've even wondered if it affects the way I think, because I actually perceive the world a little bit differently, and there's all kinds of ways my eyes play tricks on me. But I don't feel bonded to other people who have this condition in the same way two people who are deaf may feel bonded by the fact that they have a special language. So I think they have to be dealt with differently. I think that we need to separate these kinds of cases.
Yes.
Thank you again so much.
By the way, just to reveal biases, if I did have a kid, I'd get the condition corrected as quickly as possible, because even if it does have some weird advantage I don't know about, I figure life provides plenty of challenges. So if not this one, another one will build the kid's character. But meanwhile, they'll be able to play baseball.
Oh, wow. Well, on that note, Alta Charo, thank you so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure. And we hope to continue the conversation. We're so glad that you're one of our alumni now. And I think in September, we're going to be looking forward to a report coming out. Is that right?
So September from the International Commission, and then later in the fall or early winter from the World Health Organization. And thank you, by the way, to the Berggruen Institute for the support it gave to the fellowship. That was a luxurious semester and a bit before the pandemic shut us down.
Oh, good.
It was a real treat and an honor. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll let you get to your homework now.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Matter, a podcast by the Berggruen Institute that explores some of the biggest challenges facing our societies and shaping who we are as humans. During this time of great transformations, we need new ideas and deep, long-term thinking more than ever. We invite you to join us in discovery. You can find us on social media at Berggruen Institute, and please subscribe to Noema, our new digital and print magazine at noemamag.com.